Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for a fascinating discussion with author Banafsheh Keynoush, the author of Iran's Regional Dynamics, A Piecemeal Approach, that was published in the Middle East Policy Journal in summer of 2020. We've invited her here to speak today because in light of the recent Iranian elections, her journal article is extremely relevant, provides excellent background for the situation, and then we can go into discussing the future. So first, to properly introduce her, Banafsheh Keynoush is a foreign affairs scholar and a fellow at the International Institute for Iranian Studies. She did fieldwork in the Middle East for 2 decades, was recently a visiting scholar at Princeton and a visiting fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. She is the author of several books, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, Friends or Foes, and the editor and author of Iran's Interregional Dynamics in the Near East. Miss Banafsheh Keynoush has frequently appeared on CNN International, has conducted work advising the United Nations, and was also a chief interpreter for Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi from 2003 to 2010, and worked as an interpreter in a number of dual-track international peace talks. So she has really been had a seat at the table and witnessed these events play out firsthand. We are so excited to have you today, Banafsheh. Thank you for joining us. To begin, can you just please give us a brief overview of your article, including your thesis, some of your subpoints, and then your conclusion?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for having me. I want to thank the Middle East Policy Council and the Middle East Policy Journal for publishing my article on Iran's regional dynamics, and to thank you specifically, Bassima Alghussein, for hosting this event. I published this article, which was the culmination of 2 years of conversations with colleagues in the region, in the Middle East, that came from Iran's neighboring environment. My colleagues were from a number of the Gulf Cooperation Council states. From Turkey, we had a colleague representing the viewpoints of Israel, Jordan, Palestine, etc. And this event was held while I was at Princeton. And I decided to convert the results of our discussions into this final article that I presented to your journal, and earlier based on a book that was written also on the subject that has just come out. Now, I'm very pleased with the findings of this article because it rests for the first time on the viewpoints of Iran's neighbors about Iran. We've heard a lot about what Iran thinks about its position in the Middle East region, but seldom do we take a seat back and say, well, what does a smaller country neighboring Iran, such as Oman or Jordan, or really indeed, what do the Palestinians really think about Iran when you sit down and talk to them as an unbiased listener, as an unbiased analyst. And the findings of it were fascinating. I've mentioned these findings in the article that you have published, and briefly to summarize it, it begins with a statement that seems quite obvious, and that is that the 6 GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, and I hope, and Bahrain, have a harder challenge formulating independent foreign policies toward Iran because they are more dependent as well on, say, their security relationships with the United States in order to articulate a policy on Iran. Countries such as Turkey and Israel that lead their own independent foreign policies have an easier time containing the Iranian challenge. And they engage with Iran based on their own terms, not on Iran's terms. And finally, Iran has the biggest influence in conflict zones, specifically in Arab conflict zones, in countries like Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq. And in those corridors, so-called corridors of conflict, it is where Iran really tries to exert influence. But when you put the whole picture together of the GCC and of the periphery countries of Turkey and Israel, along with Palestinian and Jordanian interests, and those corridors of conflict interests, you realize that pretty much all the countries in the region want a far less involvement by Iran, and that Iran's influence in the region is not what we normally assume. We normally assume that Iran has unprecedented levels of influence across the region, and that is far from reality, far from the truth. And the article that I presented to you really goes in detail about why that is the case in each and every case of the countries that I have covered. And I'll be happy to go into more detail, but I wanted to offer this introduction and let you please lead the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that incredible overview. I found your article to be fascinating exactly for the reasons that you just outlined, in that I was very surprised to see some of the points you make about Iran having less of an interest of being an influencer in specific places than I've ever heard. And one of the things that stood out to me the most was that you argue that Iran is less of an influencer in Jordan and Palestine specifically. And I wonder how you kind of reconcile that with the narrative that happens in the US media that Iran is a primary funder of Hamas and so on and so forth.
Can I just take a leeway here and say something about the issue of how Iran is portrayed in the media, oftentimes in the United States? We do tend to demonize Iran, and rightfully so, very often. But at the same time, we fail to take a step back and really calculate what the constant demonization implies for our own policies toward Iran. It essentially prevents us from digging deeper and understanding the nuances of how Iran operates across the region. And once we are able to find what that really means, then we're actually doing ourselves more of a favor. We'll be able to better understand Iran, and also Iran, honestly, some favor, because we'll give, what's the word? We cut them some slack and let them, take a little bit of a break and really begin to understand their role in the region, not out of fear, but out of a position of we are just one of many countries. By demonizing Iran, we're actually allowing Iran to continue to do what it does because it feels more justified. But having said that, in the case of Palestine specifically, Palestine has always been far more under the influence of Egypt than it has in Iran, by Iran. And it was sometime in the 1990s that Iran finally fully recognized that. If we go back to the history of Iran's revolution since 1979, Iran always had tensions with the Palestinians, especially with Yasser Arafat and the PLO, from even before the beginning of the revolution, but more so after the revolution, especially because the PLO sided with Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. And Pan-Arabism was far more important to the PLO than being a proxy of Iran. Over the years, Iran began supporting other groups, other Palestinian groups that had far less say at the table than Iran did. Now, Hamas has a lot of say, but Hamas, again, remains far more influenced by Egypt. And in the case of the recent Gaza war, it was Egypt that was able to broker an understanding between Hamas and Israel to halt to have a ceasefire. Iran hopes to be a bigger player, but because Iran needs Egypt in North Africa, because Iran needs Egypt's balancing role with countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran will not permanently ignore Egypt's interests in Palestine. In the case of Jordan, Jordan has a tight security, understandably so, because of its borders with Syria, because of its borders with Palestine, and therefore Iranian influence in Jordan is far less limited. Furthermore, many Western countries, and primarily the United States, back Jordan's government, which prevents unhindered Iranian access into Jordan. And Jordan, needless to say, has a very small Shia population. Iran does have cells in both Palestine and Jordan, but it does not feel like it can operate them at all times freely. And that tells us that Iran's influence is not at the level that it might claim it is.
I understand. Thank you for that analysis. I also thought it was interesting in your article when you clarified that Iran attempts to contain Israel in Lebanon, but via their presence in Lebanon, and that this had to change to more of a forward defense posture after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. In the US media, going back, to the point you made earlier, we're always hearing this analysis that, Israel is very much under threat by the state of Iran. We never hear the inverse of that Iran is very much under threat by the state of Israel. And therefore, some of these policies or some of these activities are an attempt to either contain that or thwart it, et cetera. So I was wondering if you could just kind of speak to that for a few minutes.
Iran and Israel, along with Turkey, represent the periphery countries of the Middle East region in that all three of them are non-Arab states. So there's an unspoken truth among the three of them that they cannot irreversibly make each other too weak to the point of allowing the Arab core countries to determine the outcome of their foreign policy interactions with one another. That does not mean that Israel or Iran have an easy time with each other. They do not, as we all know, and the nature of their relations is heavily securitized, but that unspoken reality determines how they treat each other. And that is one reason why Israel and Iran have not gone into war despite a great deal of talk about it. To date. Of course, the United States has played a critical role in this process of appeasing Israeli concerns. But Israel understands, Israel is in a difficult position. On the one hand, it wants Iran contained. On the other hand, completely destabilizing Iran will trigger a series of regional events, not all of which might be to Israel's liking. Israel is still a distant kind of threat to Iran. However, after the recent agreements between and diplomatic relationships between Israel and some of Iran's neighbors, Iran understands that Israel has come closer to its border as a threat. But still, what's fascinating is that Iran chooses to maintain a securitized relationship with Israel, but not irreversibly engage in a direct conflict with Israel yet, because that then does not necessarily serve what Iran wants to gain from the region, which is a level of acceptance, a level of engagement, while also retaining what influence Iran might have, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. So I also thought it was, very interesting. Obviously, we're just coming off of the ends of the Saudi and Emirati-led blockade of Qatar. And in your article, you discussed how there were opportunities for mediation, both with Kuwait and with Qatar as kind of tools to help decrease some of the Shia-Sunni tension and Iran-Saudi and Iran-Israel rivalries that we see in the region. And so I have two questions on that. Obviously, even though the blockade is over, the relationship between Qatar and the Emirates and the Saudis is complicated. There are lots of strings attached. And so do you think that there still is an opportunity for Qatar to be considered a credible broker, that there's enough trust between the Gulf states that they would, and allow for Qatar to do that? Or do you think really we should pivot and focus on having Kuwait be a leading mediator in this area?
Kuwait is less ambitious in the context of the GCC and its regional goals. Kuwait's primary goals on the economic front are to meet a couple of investment criteria and goals for its Vision 2035. That involves doing trade and commerce with Iran and Iraq and using Kuwait's port capacities in the Gulf, which are not on par with what UAE, for example, port capacities are yet. And so Kuwait is viewed as a credible mediator by Iran. I'm not certain how much sway Kuwait necessarily has at all times, because in the end of the day, it is a very small country with limited ambitions in the region. Qatar has more ambitions, and Qatar has other interlocutors, including the United States. Qatar engages with the United States considerably. Qatar is a player in the Palestinian conflict to an extent. Qatar was a player in the Syrian conflict to an extent. Qatar remains a player with the Taliban and in Afghanistan to an extent. So I think Qatar will try to leverage the Kuwaiti, Qatari, Iranian kind of axis of negotiation while retaining a strong voice for Qatar. Iran is more hesitant towards Qatar than it is toward Kuwait. I think if I were the GCC, if I were the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, I would leverage the UAE, Bahraini, Saudi axis of negotiation with Iran so that it moves on par with the Kuwaiti, Qatari, and Oman is a little bit on that end too. And I think that will give more coherence to GCC policies to Iran, and it will serve not only the GCC, but it will also serve Iran in understanding that it must deal with the GCC as a more coherent body moving forward.
Thank you for pointing that out. I have long felt the same. And I'm wondering if to me, that seems like very much the clear way to move forward. However, yet we see that it hasn't been happening. So what is, I guess, the political will like on the ground to actually make progress with these relationships and seek out diplomatic solutions versus just, having a shut door?
Well, you might be surprised if I said that the hardliners have been quite critical in Iran of the performance of the Rouhani government towards Iran's neighbors, particularly the GCC countries. They have said for a very long time that the Rouhani government ignored these countries in the process of leading the nuclear talks with the United States and other world powers. And because they have been saying that a number of years, we can expect a level of outrage by Ebrahim Raisi's government toward the GCC countries. But that does not mean that Iran is informed about what kind of outreach best serves Iranian interests and GCC interests. And I believe that it is the task of the GCC to better inform Iran. And they can do so by understanding that the region is past that point of trying to rectify its problems through confidence building measures. They don't work. The Hormuz peace initiative that President Rouhani forwarded went nowhere. The reason is that there's too much problems in the region, too many imbalances of power. And what they must do is begin and engage in a bottom-up conversation with Iran, begin with areas that they can agree on. There are several, and then move to more securitized areas and discussions, irrespective of the outcome of the nuclear talks. So in other words, whether those talks succeed or fail, the region must kind of train Iran about how to engage with it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, now pivoting to the election of Ibrahim Raisi, how do you think that changes some of the dynamics in the proxy conflicts that Iran is involved in? For example, Yemen and Syria, if it makes any difference at all?
He has said in his first couple of press interviews that Yemen is his is a foreign policy priority. So, if you allow me, I'll take the case of Yemen, which is pretty complicated. Um, Yemen obviously involves a third party, which is Saudi Arabia. And if you look at the history of conflicts between Saudi Arabia and Iran, unfortunately, it plays out on the battlefield. During the Iran-Iraq war, Iran raised the stakes to get what it thought it could from Saudi Arabia and the rest of the GCC states. Iran has the same mentality, believe me not or not, after 40 years. The lessons there are lost to Iran of how expensive the Iran-Iraq war turned out to be in terms of economic costs and the human costs. So we can expect that Iran will insist on its positions in Yemen to get more out of Saudi Arabia in the final picture. But then the question is, what does that final picture look for Ibrahim Raisi? He has said very clearly that that final picture is a stabilized Yemen. It is the end of the conflict in Yemen. So the question is, if that's what Iran wants, why does it want to raise the stakes? Does it want to raise the stakes to get into a direct conflict with Saudi Arabia, or does it want to raise the stakes to force Saudi Arabia to listen to Iran more? And I would argue that it is the second case. And so if Saudi Arabia feels secure enough and safe enough to accept this kind of argument, then that places Saudi Arabia, as well as the countries that have an interest in Yemen, like the United States, like the Europeans, to really begin engaging with the Houthis on a whole different level, and to view them not just as proxies of Iran, but as actors who have some battlefield gains and therefore will have some say, and to really try to exert the same level of influence over the Houthis that Iran will have or has, and that will kind of rebalance the conflict in Yemen. I'm certain that Iran cannot afford to have the conflict get out of hand, because Raisi's main task is to fix the Iranian economy and to dignify the hardliners before the eyes of the Iranian people, that the hardliners are capable of delivering what the people of Iran expect.
Excellent. So that brings me to my next question, which is, this election had historically low voter turnout. And I'm wondering, does that signal a growing wave of disillusionment with Iranian politics, with the hardliners? Do they feel particular pressure to kind of deliver domestic wins to, win over more domestic popularity? And if so, how are some ways that they could do that? And how does the JCPOA, if at all, intersect with that?
That's an excellent question. It certainly does. But historically, Iran has had at least two other low voter turnout elections. One involved the presidency of its current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, when he was president. And during the Rafsanjani era, his second election had a considerably lower voter turnout. And so we can't readily assume that Iranians, for example, will engage in heightened levels of civic disobedience because of lower voter turnout, especially because it is not the presidency in Iran that determines policies at all times. However, the presidency does have quite an influence on domestic politics, on Iran's economic policies, on Iran's investment policies. And so on that front, it's really critical for Ibrahim Raisi to deliver. It's more so critical, not just because of low voter turnout and less confidence in the Iranian government and in the revolution, which is represented by it, but because the nuclear talks are at a critical juncture. And if sanctions are not lifted on Iran US-led sanctions, Iran will have an enormously difficult time delivering on the economic front. So I would argue it's not so much the outcome of the nuclear talks that matter so much to Ebrahim Raisi, because he is a hardliner and he has deep reservations about those talks. But the fact that Iran remains engaged with world powers and the United States to ease pressures on Iran on the economic front. And I think right now in Vienna, they're trying to sort out some of these issues. Does that answer some of the questions that you raised?
Absolutely. Yes, so there are negotiations occurring between US and Iran over the JCPOA in Vienna. And I think my understanding is that while Raisi is a hardliner and is not so much a fan of non-proliferation, he certainly is a fan, or rather is under pressure by the domestic Iranian population to improve the economic situation, and that the JCPOA offers an opportunity for him to deliver on that promise. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And if we take the argument that I presented in the article that you published, that Iran is far less influential in the region than what one assumes, and we accept that argument, then obviously Tehran is far more aware of the limits of its power in the region than any other actor. And therefore, it's more important for Tehran to engage with the GCC, but also with the United States and with other world powers more than we think. That does not necessarily give us the results we want, but that does give room for engagement.
Yes, there's definitely, I can see how if you do accept that, if one does accept that argument, that there's a larger opportunity for increased engagement than we may have thought in the past. So to complicate matters even further, the US is currently sanctioning Raisi for human rights abuses at the same time that the Biden administration is trying to work to revive the JCPOA and end the war in Yemen. How do you think the United States can best handle relations with Iran going forward, balancing these multiple interests?
Human rights has always been a secondary tool in the conduct of US foreign policy, not the primary tool. The primary tool obviously is security and world peace. So with those words, I think that the United States has always left some room for negotiations on the human rights front. Yesterday, Iran's government came out and made a statement saying that in Vienna, we have agreed that some sanctions against the hardliners in Iran will be lifted. The United States, the US State Department rejected that claim this morning, but I imagine that some conversation has occurred on this subject in Vienna. So by the same token, I imagine that similar conversations will emerge about how to handle Mr. Raisi's human rights record. And if security and figuring out what to do with Iran's security challenge comes first, then naturally, as a head of state, Mr. Raisi will need a level of international immunity to be able to engage with the world. If that is not forthcoming, we will complicate the current relationship that we have with Iran. And I don't have a problem with that as long as we know what we want out of it. And as long as we're clear and we're able to achieve it. But if we are not, then Iran will turn into a bigger problem than it is for us now.
So with shifting regional power dynamics in the region, especially in light of energy transitions and climate change, I mean, do you see Iran and Saudi Arabia as the key players in terms of the balance, maintaining like some sort of balance of power, or do you see more in Israel, Iran maintaining a balance of power in the region?
That's a very tough question to answer because on the energy front, I would argue that the balance of power doesn't rest so much on what Iran is able to contribute right now. Iran's energy industry has been out of the picture for a very long time, and the Chinese have stepped in with a 25-year agreement to help Iran figure what to do with its energy resources. Iran has learned the lesson that it cannot rely on others, such as the West, to develop its energy resources any further. Even with Saudi Arabia, Aramco has not necessarily had an easy time with investments in recent years. So if you allow me, I'd like to keep the energy debate out of the security aspect of the debate for now. And Israel's growing say in the Gulf Cooperation Council is somewhat of a concern, not just for Iran, but also for Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is traditionally the dominant power in the GCC, and Saudi Arabia is also a leader in the Muslim world. And so how Saudi Arabia navigates Israel's growing influence may involve a level of engagement and conversation with Israel, but also a level of understanding that Saudi Arabia's security interests must be preserved. And so in this midst, the imbalance of power with Iran will exacerbate if countries like Saudi Arabia or the GCC and Israel team up, obviously, against Iran. What's fascinating is that Ibrahim Raisi is keeping the doors of engagement with world powers open. And the United States and Iran have a converging interest at the moment under the Biden administration, which is to prevent a conflict in the region. So we have to see how that will counter any other movements near Iran's borders by Israel. I don't think any of this is new, because even under the Obama administration, President Obama had to do a lot of convincing with both Saudi Arabia and with Israel to come on board with the idea of a nuclear agreement with Iran. Later on, under the Trump administration, despite the anti-Iran rhetoric of his administration, he didn't get into war with Iran. He didn't want it. And obviously, he was appeasing Saudi Arabia and Israel in more ways than we know. And President Biden is doing the same thing, appeasing Saudi Arabia and Israel. So we have to see where these dynamics lead and how they will exacerbate or lessen the power imbalances.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Banafsheh. This has been a fascinating discussion. I wish I could talk with you for 4 hours. But I think this is a great way to wrap up the conversation. I wanted to ask you about the Abraham Accords, and you've spoken to that. So I think I just want to say thank you and remind everybody that the article, Iran's Regional Dynamics, A Piecemeal Approach, is online and available for free to read for the next 2 weeks. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at that, and then also continue to follow Banafsheh Keynoush's amazing work as she goes forward in her career. This continues to be a hot topic, and she has a very interesting and unique insights to offer. So thank you for sharing them with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a great